Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren Centrella, and I'm the Interim Chief Development Officer here at WAMU. WAMU's mission is to connect listeners and members like you to each other and the world. We offer our audience opportunities to learn and engage both with the news as well as cultural conversations like this. Public radio works because listeners and members who value the service step up and give back. Support from listeners and members is also our most reliable and important source of funding, especially right now. This book club would not be possible if we did not have your support. In this season of giving and throughout the year, if you enjoy the discussion today, please consider making a gift to support this series of events. You can donate at dianerehm.org/give. We're grateful for all of you that have registered to join us today, and we are glad to have you with us for this panel discussion. This event is being recorded and closed captioning is available. Just click the CC button on your screen. And now let's start the discussion with the host of our book club, Diane Rehm.
Thank you, Lauren, and welcome to all of you. It's so good to have you with us in this new year. Our book club today will discuss Pachinko by Min-Jin Lee. She was a finalist for the 2017 National Book Award. This epic follows 4 generations of a Korean immigrant family in Japan. Part history lesson, part intimate portrait. There'll be much to talk about. Joining me, Alexander Chee. He's author of Edinburgh and The Queen of Night. Maureen Corrigan is book critic for NPR's Fresh Air and distinguished professor of literary criticism at Georgetown University. And David Roh, English professor at the University of Utah and author of Minor Transpacific, Triangulating American, American, Japanese, and Korean fictions. Of course, we'll take your questions throughout our discussion. You can type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to get to just as many as we can. Welcome to all of you. It's great to have you with us. Alex, I'd like to start with you. Min-Jin Lee says the first sentence of her book serves as her thesis statement for the story. She begins, "History has failed us, but no matter." What does this line mean in your view?
It's a wonderful, even magisterial first line, right? There's an extraordinary confidence behind it. It evokes Tolstoy to my mind. I think this novel is one of the few novels that I would consider Tolstoyan in a way that I don't think reduces what she's accomplished here. I think also of how when you are Korean American, your family is your first resource for historical information about the past. You are not taught your history in schools in America, for the most part. I think increasingly we see that that's happening. But this novel, for example, it told so many Korean Americans, as well as Americans, about a part of our history that we didn't know.
I must say, I am one of those Americans who did not know this story of Korean life during this period of time. Maureen, I gather you had read Min Jin Lee's prior book before you read this one. What was different for you about this one as opposed to her earlier novel?
Well, I think, as Alexander has said, the sweep of history that you get here, the cast of characters, everything that makes it Tolstoyan or Dickensian, and of course, Min Jin Lee is explicitly nodding to Dickens throughout the novel as well. I mean, how many of these can you write? This novel is just so much wider in scope. And yet, when you read that first line, Diane, as well as ethnicity, I think of class in Free Food for Millionaires, Min Jin Lee was very aware of a story about class and the people who get forgotten because, they're working class or below, and they're just not, quote unquote, worthy of notice by traditional history.
David, tell us about your perspective on that first line and how it conveys to us what's coming.
Yeah, I want to underscore what Alex and Maureen have said. I mean, the word that comes to mind when I think about Pachinko is scale, right? It's the first time I've seen a Korean diasporic story in English told on this kind of scale, this large, with so many different generations, so many different characters over many decades. And I'm coming from a field in which zainichi studies is relatively niche. And it's about this Korean minority in Japan, but Pachinko blows up that story on the scale it deserves. And it's kind of endearingly romantic novel. It has this operatic tragedy, torrid love affairs, huge reversals of fortunes. And like Maureen said, it's completely unapologetic in its grandness. And it's really quite open about its ambitions to stand next to Dickens, to troll up to Eliot. And Alex talked about history in a small sense, like history with a lowercase h. But I think the beginning line is about tackling history with the capital H, right? Because it's a narrative about people who have been systematically erased, deleted, ground into a fine powder, and yet they endure. So, it's no wonder the novel begins by kind of throwing down the gauntlet and saying, no, we're still here.
We're still here. The word pachinko actually refers to a kind of game similar, but in its own way very different from American pinball machines. But David, explain how it's different.
Yeah, it's often compared to like an upright pinball machine.
Yeah.
And you go to any train station in Japan, and you'll see pachinko parlors buttressing the station, and you'll see it's this loud cacophonous game. We have all these metal balls cascading down this surface, and there's really no control. Like there's no buttons to push where you're directing the balls, and the goal is to get the balls in this little cup, and that's how you get the payout. And you have a little dial that's ostensibly kind of changes the direction of the balls, but doesn't really do anything. So it just, from an outsider's perspective, it looks like just pure chaos. But I think it's a great sort of metaphor for the positionality of the zainichi. And I should want to define zainichi for you. Zainichi meaning Korean, in this case, Korean resident in Japan. That's what the Japanese call it.
Zainichi is a word I didn't know, so I'm glad you defined that for us. It is the Koreans living in Japan. How were they somehow overtaken and brought to Japan, Alex, or was it simply that Japan annexed that portion of Korea?
All of the language for describing what the Japanese at the time did to Korea and Korean culture all sound almost implausibly mild or calm compared to what the experience was like. And, you know, so for the annexation, colonization lasted for 35 years.
Wow.
And I think you know, something to think about is, you know, in the beginning of Young-Hil Kang's novel, East Goes West, which is widely considered to be like the first Korean American novel published in the early 1930s. The narrator in that novel talks about Korea as if Korea has been destroyed forever. There was no anticipation that contemporary Korea as it exists now would ever come back by the people who were alive then, by many of them, not everyone, but many of them. And so I think when we say that they were Japanese living in Korea, what we mean is that they were brought there, usually forcibly, to work in Japanese factories or other menial jobs. And when the war was ended so violently, it ended the occupation, but the Japanese did nothing to return Koreans to Korea.
I must
Either in
say,
Japan or also in Shanghai, for example, where they had also brought Koreans as well. So it was this kind of just everything dropped, and these people were left abandoned to their existence there.
I must say, the history presented in this book, without, as I say, having known anything about it to begin with, I found absolutely fascinating. And I thought to myself how similarly the Koreans were treated by the Japanese as those slaves here in this country were treated by whites when they brought them here from Africa. Maureen, did you feel that kind of comparison?
I felt the terror of reading about people who have next to no control over their lives. When David was describing the Pachinko game, I kept thinking, well, of course, it's a great metaphor for what happens to so many of the characters in this novel. You can try to have control over your life. You can try to better yourself. Maybe to some degree you will. But there's also a sense of the game is rigged. It's either rigged by history, or by war, or,
Right.
you're limited in your control.
And it was rigged right from day one when it began. David, how accurate do you think Min Jin Lee's portrayal of the Korean-Japanese history is?
Broadly speaking, it's quite accurate. Min Jin Lee did extensive research before writing the novel and wrote it several times, I believe. And so the broad brushstrokes are definitely ring true. And the Pachinko parlors are largely run by zainichi Koreans who have some North Korean affiliation, simply because they can't, generally speaking, go into like the corporate workforce because companies won't hire them, or traditionally that's not been the case. And so they have to go through these kind of extra legal sort of gray market arenas of enterprise. And that is why a lot of Japanese people look down upon pachinko parlors, because they're seen as kind of illicit and have this kind of criminal element to it. And that is mapped onto the zainichi as well. There are some liberties that Lee takes with the novel, and that's quite an atypical zainichi story. If you look at the tradition of zainichi literature in Japan, written in Japanese by zainichi authors, this is not sort of the usual kind of trajectory, but we could talk a little bit more about that later.
Well, Maureen, talk about Sunja. I mean, she is the character who, from her birth, practically runs through the entire novel. And she is the daughter of very, very poor parents who operate a boarding house. And her mother and her father, Huni, maintain a rather good reputation in that regard.
Yes, Sunja is, I feel like everything I'm going to say about her is going to flatten her out. And one of Lee's accomplishments here is that she really makes these characters breathe and gives them the full dimension of living people. Sunja is so interesting because she's unlike so many heroines of literature, she's not beautiful, but she's a woman who, if you look at her, you start to see her beauty.
Yes.
And unfortunately, I guess, she attracts the attention of Hanso, who's a kind of a gangster figure. Ultimately, I would call him that. Perhaps that's incorrect. In the story, she has an affair with him when she's very young.
She loves him.
She loves
she
him,
falls in love.
And it seems like he loves her.
I agree.
He's a character I'd like to talk about too, but she becomes pregnant by him. And of course that changes the trajectory of her life, and that their connection echoes throughout the decades that this novel spans.
Because he is married, he wants her to become his mistress. He tells her he will support her and the child. He will create living quarters for her. But when Sunja realizes that he is married, has a family of 3 daughters, she says, absolutely not. But Alex, he doesn't let go of her, does he? Oh dear, you are
Oops, here I am, sorry.
That's okay. Just leave your microphone open.
I will.
If you would.
He doesn't let her go, but I think, part of what I love about this novel and about her in particular as a character is what a shrewd bargainer she is consistently throughout, and so determined. Like, there is just such a extraordinary determination on her part not to have less than what she wants. And everyone who meets her encounters this aspect of her personality all the way through the decades, and it builds a great deal of the story, the way that she has to suffer for what she is trying to get, and the way she pushes him as well. So
it's interesting that early on in the novel, Sunja is told that for women, life is suffering. And boy, Maureen, does she suffer.
She does. And I know you're heading in that direction, but I also want to say, and she works. I mean, this novel does an amazing job of dramatizing work, everyday work. I mean, Sunja and her sister-in-law, Kyung-hee, they take it upon themselves to start, they make candy and they sell it outside the train station. And you get a sense of what that means to get up at 3 a.m. and start the pots boiling and then stand there all day trying to sell what you've made to commuters. And, I think it's a real challenge. Maybe Alex can speak to this, for novelists to really dramatize everyday work. Usually, I haven't found it to the degree that I'm finding it in this novel, in very many other novels.
David, do you want to comment, or Alex, do you want to comment?
I was just going to add that, yes, as a novelist, it is something to, as I tell my students, like whenever a story doesn't feel grounded, like, imagine how your characters pay their bills. And usually the story comes down to earth. Going back to the history conversation briefly, I know from writing my own fiction, it's incredibly difficult to find stories about how working class people made their living in the past, but also like this is where I think we should mention Minjin did extensive interviews as a part of her research with zainichi people living in Japan, and was really creating a kind of archive, because what she wanted access to, in a sense, didn't exist.
David?
Yeah, related to that, I actually wanted to ask my fellow panelists a question about Sunja and her relationship to Kohansu, because part of the reason why she works so hard is because I think at heart, what connects Sunja and Hansu together are that they're both pragmatists, right? That Kohansu, maybe on a different scale or a different level, he has no allegiance to any nation, just for himself. That's all he cares about, is accruing capital for himself. And in some ways, Sunja is similar in that she is okay with violating some social norms, working outside the home and encouraging her sister to work outside the home with her, just to survive, because she knows her back is against the wall. But Sunja does kind of draw the line in terms of a sense of morality, in terms of her relationship with Kohansu. But I was always kind of confused, because you see her grappling with this back and forth throughout the narrative, questioning why can't she be with Hansu or not, and kind of bristling against the sort of social norms that confine her. But I was always confused as to like where she drew the line. Like, what is the difference between Kohansu and Sunja? And I want to ask if the panelists had an idea.
Maureen?
Yeah, I think that scene where Hansu beats up his mistress,
Oh boy,
brutally in the back of a limousine later in the novel. Again, I think this novel is so brilliant. It was almost like a nudge to me to remember he's not a really good guy, and Sunja seems to also know that he's very morally flawed, and yet she's attracted to him. It's that kind of irrationality of whatever sexual erotic attraction that can't be explained.
But at the same time, he feels duty bound to care for her and for the son who is born, named Noah. And he, from his, what shall I call it, gangster-like position, can keep track of everything that the family, including Noah and including the second child who is born after another character enters the picture, and that's Isak Beck. Isak is a minister who seeks out Sunju's home because he's heard that the food is so good there, but he's clearly very sick. And he is a devout minister, in contrast to Hansu. You have this character who is so wonderful and so loving and so giving that he gives his life in the midst of this Japanese feeling that the only deity in that country is the emperor, and therefore any worship of God is absolutely to be forbidden. Tell us about that scene, Alex, where Isak is arrested and why.
Oh, well, he's it's his disobedience to the Japanese government, right? The sort of political aspect of the story, that the way that he's sort of I guess a rebel isn't really like the right word for it, but in that context, I suppose it works to make what he's doing legible. I was thinking back just to how it seemed to me Sunjo was trying to show her gangster lover a lesson about her, just in the way that she shows, which is sort of like, I'm not going to be a bargain to be had cheaply. and I'm going to make you pay, even for thinking that. And I think there's, at least that's what I imagine. Maybe I'm leaning too heavily into it, but yes, he is, the man she chooses is not just a minister, not just a sort of convalescent, but he's also he's also fighting for something that he won't live to see enacted, which is a kind of, and he's doing it because he believes in it, and it doesn't matter to him whether he lives to see it or not, which is like one of the sort of extraordinary things about him. He's not just somebody she's settling for exactly, even though it, and yet it's still a surprise to her, and it's not a welcome surprise that her husband is an idealist.
David?
Yeah, he is this kind of angelic figure who is this depiction of innocence, and he has his sort of religious convictions that cause him to sacrifice, and he comes from an affluent background, and so that dramatizes his sacrifices even further. But I think it's an illustration of what Lee is trying to depict here, is that, I mean, there's throughout the novel this whole discourse about, especially with Noah, something that he inherits, this idea that if you work really hard, if you are a good citizen, if you keep your nose clean, then somehow you can transcend your zainichi-ness, your Koreanness. And that does not work out for Peg Isak. He is ground up into the colonial machine, and despite his sacrifice, despite his morality, there's no moral reward for him, at least in his physical realm. He is a victim of circumstance.
He has tuberculosis to begin with. He becomes very sick as soon as he arrives at the boarding house, and Sunja and her mother bring him really back to health, and that's where you find he is caring for them while they are caring for him. We have a question from the audience. Cindy says, I'm Chinese American. My husband is Korean American. Our parents would always talk about Japanese people as the enemy. They grew up with the terror of war and occupation by the Japanese, similar to what's described in Pachinko. But for us, having been born and raised in the US, we feel more of a bond with Japanese Americans than we do animosity. We are all Asian Americans living in this country. Do the panelists have conflicting feelings? Were you taught to dislike the Japanese for their historic actions, but end up feeling more of a bond with them because of your common cultural backgrounds? David?
Yeah, I can speak to that. I similarly, when I was growing up, my parents always talked about how the Japanese can't be trusted, and there are these intergenerational scars from the colonial period that they've inherited and trying to pass on to me as well. But I felt, growing up here in the States as an Asian American, I understood that even if I can articulate at the time that my position as a Korean American, as Asian American, there was a kind of ethnic solidarity with Japanese Americans that didn't really translate with my parents' generation as first generation versus second generation, right? So I can completely understand Cindy's question, and there's a tension there. So, for example, when I graduated from college, I actually went to Japan for a year to teach English, and my father took me aside before I departed and said, under no circumstance are you supposed to come back with a Japanese partner. And I was just kind of flabbergasted because I was just like, this is not even a conversation that I even began to consider. But to me, it was a salient moment that even though he had been in the States for 30 some odd years, that those scars, he was born post-liberation, but those scars are not easily erased, and they have an effect down the line. Even I would say as a second generation Korean American, they still color and influence my sort of view of myself as an Asian American and my relationship with Japan in complicated ways that I don't necessarily know if I can articulate fully.
Alex, what about you?
So a lot of my family was born during the occupation. And my grandfather, I have written about this, but he told me when I was very young about how he still dreamt in Japanese. It was his first language, even though he grew up in Korea. And he would sit around and watch sumo wrestling in the afternoon sometimes, and he had Japanese friends in business that he dealt with. He had a complicated relationship, I would say, to it, in the sense that he was in the fisheries business. He had been educated in Japan because the Imperial University, if I'm remembering this correctly, was one of the first places in the world to offer a degree in fisheries. And he was thus one of the first people to pursue that degree during the occupation era. But he was also he wrote an autobiography where he talks about how unfairly he was treated as someone who was working for the Japanese, and how people would take credit for his accomplishments and all these kinds of things that were just a kind of constant part of his life. And so he became a rice smuggler, which is something that I definitely want to research more. But all of that is stuff that I learned as an adult for the most part. I knew very little about the occupation when I was younger, and
Interesting.
my family wouldn't really talk about it,
Yeah.
which is very
And
common. Yeah.
so common, absolutely. Maureen, talk about the way Min Jin Lee explores the varieties and nuances of the prejudice, the Korean Japanese face.
Yeah, it again, the fact that this is a multi-generational story really intensifies and complicates what she's exploring here in terms of prejudice. You know, the war years you can see are fairly straightforward, and then we go beyond that into the late 40s, the 50s, the 60s, when Sunja's sons are pursuing their different lives, and then her grandchildren, and still they keep coming up against this sense of you're always going to be perceived as Korean. I think it's really interesting when we get to the grandson's generation, and Solomon, who is working as a banker, and he has a Korean American girlfriend who, he brings over to Japan, where he's working. And those two characters, Solomon and his girlfriend, have very different experiences. Of course, I'm reading this from the outside, not from the inside, like my fellow panelists with their family history, but they just have very different senses of how they should be perceived. And I think Solomon's girlfriend really just has that kind of stereotypical freedom of an American thinking, I'm not going to be limited somehow by the fact that I'm Korean American, and being in Japan sort of brings her up short. I think she's isolated.
Yeah. And wants to go back to the US because of that feeling of isolation. I want to go back a little bit because Hansu manages to persuade Sunja and her mother to move to Osaka, where Huni's brother Joseph lives. And a question from Andrea: you raised, Maureen, that you saw Hansu as a villain here, but Andrea, has a question. She says, I see Joseph as the villain. His character was probably the weakest, but he had a tremendous impact on the life of Sunja, as well as his own wife. His decision to force Sunja not to reveal that Hansu is Noah's father was a fork in the road for me. Was that, in your mind, David, a fork in the road?
Yeah, I think Joseph is kind of a tragic figure. I think he is representative of a number of characters who hold fast to these kind of stark binaries in their mind, right? Joseph comes from what he considers to be a Yangban family lineage, like royalty, like a Korean aristocratic class. And so his whole image of himself is based on, I work and my wife stays home and stays pretty for me, basically. And anything that violates that is an insult or attack on me and my masculinity, right? And that causes him to find himself in a place where he is actively holding back the rest of the family from bettering themselves or improving their situation, and actively destroying them by taking out the loan from the loan sharks, right? And so there's a number of characters I think do that in the novel. They kind of hold on to these old world notions and don't really recognize the realities of the present. And that's where I think Hansu and Sunja are sort of the characters kind of navigate and weave through those tensions, right? So I don't necessarily see him as a villain. I see him as a character who just cannot adapt to the new normal.
How do you see him, Maureen?
No, I don't see him as a villain either. The novel does such a great job of showing people in their historical contexts. And as I think a lot of us are saying, sometimes the characters can't see beyond their own time. They can't imagine anything beyond the norms and the conventions of their own time. And yeah, he's one of those characters. He also has a lot of bad luck too. He's working in Japan during the war, and thanks to Hansu, is brought out back to his family, but he was working in a factory. He's been starved. He's very sick, and he spends a lot of the later years of his life an invalid, which ironically then frees up his wife and his sister-in-law to go out to work because they have to support the family.
Well, didn't he go to Nagasaki to try to find work, Alex, and was caught in the bombing that the United States did on Nagasaki, and badly, badly burned? Here is where Hansu steps in again and brings Yosef back to Osaka, where his wife and Sunji are.
And I think this is, again, to Minjin's credit, the story of how many Koreans lost their lives, or who were horribly injured that day because of the bombing, is something that is not widely known, certainly. But I was thinking about how I feel like it is very Tolstoyan not to have a single villain in which the plot reacts to. It's more like people taking turns being terrible. The sort of everybody is at times a villain, or at times the hero.
Interesting. A question from Carolyn, who says, this is a devastating story about Noah. Does Pachinko capture an accurate picture of the shame, possible exclusion from Japanese society for a capable, educated, ambitious Korean man in Japan post-World War II because of the circumstances of his paternity? Can you explain the cultural and internal psychological factors which could have led to Noah's cut off from his mother and eventual suicide? David?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good representation of how limited Noah's options are as zainichi, in terms of upward mobility and accruing social capital, joining the workforce as a salaried corporate worker. So he does have to seek out sort of alternative methods or alternative means by which he can earn a living. I think compounding that is Noah's belief in this kind of purity of himself, right? That he can somehow transcend his Korean blood because he was the son of this angelic minister, and that eventually will be, somehow he will be rewarded for that. And then when he learns that Ko Han-soo is his father, then that illusion is punctured because he realizes not only zainichi, but he's a gangster zainichi's son, and that it's not something that he'll ever wash clean. And that taps into this whole discourse about blood, how Koreans are racialized in Japan.
Yeah.
Because phenotypically they can pass as Japanese, like just walking down the street, you would never be able to tell the difference. Japanese can't tell the difference. So there has to be this other means by which they can be othered, and there's this, that means, okay, well, their blood is impure, and they smell like kimchi all the time, right? So this whole discourse about smell is really quite interesting. So Noah believes and buys into this idea about blood and impurities, and that is why when revelation is revealed to him, he tries to go on the lam, has this like double life, but then that double life can never be reconciled. And then when his mother threatens to blow that up, or he thinks he's threatening to blow that up, he ends his life.
He has, Maureen, moved in circles. He has a wonderful job. He has a grand family. He has done well, but he has stayed hidden until Hansu finally finds him, tells Sunja where he is, and Sunja is determined to see him, to say, I'm sorry I didn't tell you about Hansu. It is so emotional when you read that conversation that she has with him. What were your reactions?
Many reactions. I mean, first of all, to go back to Noah's situation for a second, I love the way that Min-Jin Lee riffs on Great Expectations here, because you have the same situation where a criminal, quote unquote, criminal father or father figure in Great Expectations is secretly paying for an education, is secretly helping a boy, in this case his son, unacknowledged, rise up in the world. And when the son learns who's responsible for funding the education, he's filled with shame. Part of the reason, of course, when Sunja is reunited with Noah, she wants to meet his children. She wants to meet his wife. Naturally, she's overjoyed at the possibility of seeing this family that she's been cut off from.
And Hansu takes her to see.
Yeah, but I think the way Min-Jin Lee writes it, you kind of get the sense that he's a little smarter than Sunja in this case, and he has more reticence in terms of his great expectations about what might happen from this reunion. And the way she ends that chapter with just that single line, letting us know that Noah has committed suicide, and then there's silence, is just masterful.
And Sunja did not expect that. She came away from that meeting thinking that there was a possibility that she would meet the wife and the child. But Noah promised to call her that evening, to give her his number, and to say when they might meet. And that call never came. And then she learns that the next day Noah has committed suicide. What was your reaction to that, Alex?
Someone in the chat, I think, or maybe it was the question that you read, was saying, like, is this an accurate depiction of this? As I recall, Min-Jin talked about how part of what drove her to write the novel was a story about a boy being bullied until he killed himself.
Yes.
In a zainichi boy in Japan. And so I do feel like in some ways Noah sort of embodies that crisis that initially drew her into the writing of the novel. And I suppose, how did I react to it? I was devastated, but I also, it's the impossible situation, I think, of something from Simone Weil's the Iliad or A Poem of Force, where she talks about how the precondition for killing someone is to make them into an object. And in that moment when they are like half human, half object, it's unendurable. And I feel like that's what his life was. Half human, half object.
The shame he felt that his blood was actually that of Hansu goes back to your point, David, about this whole question of blood running through his body. It was an extraordinary sense I had of, my God, this man feels he has the blood of a gangster living within his body.
Yeah, and that's not just him, but that's what everyone around him has been telling him his entire life. Like even later down the line when I think it's Etsuko is with Mozasu, and she's restrained from her daughter Hana, and Hana similarly has attitudes toward Etsuko like, you're dirty now because you're with a Korean gangster, a Pachinko parlor owner. So that logic has been it runs throughout not just him but multiple different characters, and so it's very hard to resist that and not to internalize that logic, right? And I'll tell you as an aside, when I was rereading this novel, and it's been a while since I read it, and I have a 2-year-old named Noah. I just completely destroyed it when I read that chapter again. It's just coincidental. My wife's grandfather's name is Noah, so that's how we got the name. But just reading that the second time around, it's like, oh man, the waterworks just started.
I can only imagine Noah was such a bright little boy, a bright young man, whereas his brother was less so. Maureen, talk about Noah's brother.
Noah's brother Mozazu. He's the second child. He's got more freedom to act up. He is not that great. He gets in trouble in school. He fights back when he's bullied, and sometimes he fights back hard. And actually becoming involved in an apprentice to a man who's running a pachinko parlor actually turns out to be a great thing for him.
Yes.
It gives him an outlet, and it gives him a world, and it gives him work. I mean, again, this kind of saving grace of work and how, even though the characters sometimes, in some cases, exhaust themselves to death, that there's something about work that's a deliverance in this novel.
Work as a deliverance, I do agree. But what about home? What does home mean to these characters, Maureen?
Home is the place you can never get to. I don't know. I mean, each of the characters, I'm running, it's a big cast of characters, so
it certainly is.
Flipping through them in my head, but especially I think of a character like Sunja. She's never going to go back to that town she came from by the sea. She's never going to have the completeness of her very early childhood world with a father who adored her. We could go down the list of characters and think about the unsettledness of this world that Min Jin Lee creates.
Home being people you love somehow, as well as a physical place. And in the end, we understand that Sunja adored Isak, but she still loved Hansu. Do you agree, Alex?
I don't, that's a good question. I'm sorry, I was thinking about actually the moment when the moment with the rice, when you were just with this question about home and the tasting the rice from Korea, which something that a lot of people might not know is that during the Japanese colonial era, most Koreans didn't get to eat Korean rice. Korean rice was sent to Japan, and so getting to eat that rice is actually like a really powerful thing, and so in some ways, like, home is where the rice tastes right. Like, in terms of like what home is for these people, and there's also a way in which I think in the background of all of this is a dream of a country that is not interfered with by either Japan or the United States, that has a sort of autonomy that isn't divided, that is something that like is in the background of all of it that I think really matters too.
Well, I must say, it is such a large novel. It covers such a sweep of history, and I read it now twice, and I can't really get it out of my head. As you said, Maureen, there are so many characters, and it is a very driven book by, I mean, religion, which we haven't even talked very much about heritage, about work. It has so many themes to it, and I shall be so happy to talk with Min-Jin Lee in our next hour about all of her themes. But in the meantime, I want to thank you all so very much. Alexander Chee, Maureen Corrigan, and David Roh for being with us. Thank you so much for lending us so much insight into Pachinko. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having
Thank you
us.
for asking me.
Thank you. And if you'd like to hear from Min-Jin Lee, she will be joining me shortly on a separate link. We'll talk about the research that goes into her novels and how her own immigrant background influences her storytelling. Before you go, please take a minute to fill out a short survey about this event. It'll pop up on your screen. And if you would, consider donating to WAMU. Your financial support is what makes it possible for us to bring you events like this one. Go to dianerehm.org/give. The next book club meeting will be Wednesday, February 22nd. Our book is Kindred by Octavia Butler. Watch your inbox for more information. The book club is produced by Allison Brody. Rashad Young is our engineer today. Yanling Zhang is our events manager. We couldn't do it without the support of Allie Dickman, Lauren Centrella, Virendra Silva, James Coates, David Tate, Jerry Washington, and Michelle Morgan. And a special thanks to all of you for being with us. I look forward to seeing you next month. I'm Diane Rehm. Have a great day.